Good morning, afternoon and evening to all of you joining us online today. This is Sarah Dalrymple, Senior Policy Advisor at Development Initiatives. We are pleased to see so many individuals and organisations represented here with us today. And I am delighted to welcome you to the second in a series of webinars being hosted by Development Initiatives in 2019. This series aims to build collaboration and coherence between humanitarian, development and peace actors, with a specific focus on financing, giving the central role that it can play in driving joined-up approaches. The first webinar, which is available on the DI website, focused on development financing trends in crisis contexts and sought to strengthen connections between humanitarian and development actors in particular. This second webinar seeks to launch our recently published 2019 Global Humanitarian Assistance Report and provide an overview of financing trends, issues and approaches in protracted crises, where the responses of humanitarian, development and peace actors overlap in practice. In our presentation and through the wider discussion today, we will explore some key overarching questions. Firstly, how can we strengthen flexible and predictable funding within and beyond the humanitarian sector? Secondly, how can we work to ensure that humanitarian funding lays the foundations for longer-term recovery, peace and development? And thirdly, how can we more systematically build preventative, anticipatory and shock-responsive financing mechanisms into development responses to enable greater flex to respond to reoccurring and protracted crises? We will be joined later in the session by prominent panelists with expertise on crisis financing, and we'll have the opportunity to discuss in plenary opportunities for moving towards a joint approach. We will also be disseminating a short satisfaction survey after the webinar. We'd be grateful if you could spend a couple of minutes on this to help us improve for future events. The Executive Director at Development Initiatives, Harpinder Kolakot, will facilitate today's discussions, drawing upon her extensive experience of engaging internationally on financing across all aspects of the Nexus. Harpinder previously worked in a range of high-level leadership, advisory and public affairs roles. She formerly worked as political advisor to the prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Harpinder, I will now hand over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. And let me just start by welcoming everybody wherever you are in the world. We've got nearly 100 participants joining us today, which is fantastic. So great to have you with us. So let me just start off by giving a bit of an introduction before I go on and introduce our panel. As we all know, the nature of protracted crisis continues to challenge all of us, humanitarian, development, peace actors alike. And between 2000 and 2017, there were 27 countries that had more than 5 consecutive years of UN-coordinated appeals. As such, there's an emerging international consensus that the need to link short-term assistance with long-term development, recovery and peace building is essential, and to build coherence between the humanitarian development and peace actors commonly operating in these contexts. And whilst international policy commitments are in place to deliver on this, such as those made by the World Humanitarian Summit and the DAC recommendation on the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, the challenge really remains at that delivery level. So to transform policy into practice, better evidence of best practice at the country level is key, and financing is a crucial aspect to this. And we will cover both aspects of those things in our presentations today and hopefully discuss further in our discussion. But financing in particular has to be delivered in the right way and through the right mechanisms, as well as going to the right places to build that coherence, the collaboration and complementarity which is vital for its success. So some progress has already been made in establishing some of the innovative financing approaches that we're seeing working that provide an interface between the humanitarian development and peace actors and space. One example is the global financing mechanism, the Global Concessional Financing Facility, which is supporting long-term development solutions in protracted refugee contexts. Shock responsive programming enabling development programs to scale up as needs intensify, and disaster risk and forecasting based financing as well. Multi-year and unearmarked for humanitarian financing enabling greater predictability and flexibility, as well as cash transfers which lay the foundations for longer term social protection programs. Demonstrating evidence on the current financing trends and their impact is going to be critical to inform decision-making on funding allocation and opportunities to scale up some of these innovative financing mechanisms. So today's webinar seeks to do just that. We'll be sharing some data on up-to-date financing trends in crisis context that have been captured in our new 2019 Global Humanitarian Assistance Report, which was launched earlier this week, and to also hear from crisis financing experts on debates and issues relevant to financing across the Nexus. Now, DI has been producing our GHA report since 2000, and it marks an annual resource for the humanitarian community, particularly decision makers who are making decisions about how and where they allocate financing. Now, over recent years, responding to the protracted nature of crisis and subsequent changes in policy and financing landscape, our report has very much adopted a wider focus beyond humanitarian financing to capture that broader resource picture, looking at humanitarian financing in the context of all financing there, particularly development financing. To deliver commitments around the Nexus and evidence based on financing, which goes beyond a narrow focus on humanitarian response, is critical. So the presentation on the GHA report will be going to, and after the presentation, we'll be going to a number of other experts. But I just want to say before I highlight the different experts we've got, we were hoping to have Rachel Scott join us from the Head of Crisis and Fragility Unit at the OECD, but unfortunately, technology has beaten us today, and she won't be able to join and make a presentation. She may be listening online, so she can listen, but unfortunately, she's unable to provide her presentation and speak to it on this software that we've got. So we won't be hearing from Rachel, but what we will do is make sure that her slides are shared with the rest of the information pack later on when we share that in the next week or so. But after Angus has presented on the GHA report, we will be hearing from Jeremy Kondiak, who is the Senior Policy Fellow at the Centre for Global Development, followed by Marta, who is the UN Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General and Humanitarian Coordinator in Iraq, and she'll be providing very much a on-the-ground perspective. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before I hand over to Angus. So all participants can hear us, and the panelists will be able to take your questions. If you can put those into the chat box, we will be collating them as the panelists are speaking, and then collate them to the end of the different presentations and put those questions to each of the panelists as they come through. Also, we're asking our participants, all of you who are listening online, to be able to tweet about the event. We've got a hashtag set up, hashtag DI_Nexus, DI in capital, the rest in lowercase, and it's one word, DI_Nexus, hashtag DI_Nexus. So with further ado, just to let you know that I think we can all hear you, and there may be certain things that are blocking some of people's access to visuals. So we're just aware of that. We'll do what we can to make sure everyone can see the presentations. But if you are having problems seeing the presentations, just to be aware that we will be sharing them afterwards. So these will be shared with you. So hopefully you can follow along as we present the presentations. So I'm going to hand over first of all to our two DI presenters. Sarah, you've already heard from today. We'll be covering some aspects of the presentation, but Angus Urquhart, who is our Crisis and Humanitarian Lead, will kick us off.
Brilliant. Many thanks, Harpinder. So as you mentioned, the focus of the webinar today is to unpack some of the key trends and developments in crisis financing. So my task today really is just to kind of set the scene and provide some form to the humanitarian and wider crisis financing landscape that we've captured in this year's GHA report, before our panelists go into some of the more detail of the specific issues and challenges that we currently face. I guess essentially what we do with the GHA report each year, with the Global Humanitarian Assistance Report, is to try and set that scene. So as Harpinder mentioned, we launched the report on Monday, and so you can now access and download it from our website. And what I'm hoping to cover in the next 10 minutes or so in my presentation is just to pick out some of the highlights from this year's report. So to briefly touch on the following areas. So what is the nature of humanitarian crises or what was the nature of humanitarian crisis in 2018? What is it, the challenge that we're seeking to address? Secondly, what are some of the trends in contributions of international humanitarian assistance that we can see? Thirdly, What progress is there that we can see, and to some extent what progress hasn't been made when we look at the way in which assistance can be delivered more efficiently to people in need? And finally, what are some of the developments in the broader crisis financing landscape? So firstly, what did the humanitarian landscape look like in 2018? We identified that there were more than 200 million people in need of humanitarian assistance in 2018. These people were living in almost a quarter of the countries in the world. However, as in previous years, we also see that large numbers of those in need were concentrated in just a few countries. Indeed, 6 countries had more than 10 million people in need: Yemen, Syria, Democratic Republic of Congo, Turkey, Afghanistan, and North Korea. It's well known that for many of these people, crisis is frequently protracted and often complex. So by complex, we mean where there's perhaps a combination of different types of crisis: conflict, forced displacement, or disasters associated with natural hazards. So new analysis we have in this year's report shows that the poorest people are disproportionately affected by recurrent crisis. As the chart you can see illustrates, countries with UN appeals in 2018 and consecutively for at least one preceding year were home to 9% of the global population, but they accommodated a third of the global population in extreme poverty, so those living on less than $1.9 per day. What we also show in the report is that when crisis hits, poverty reduces at a slower rate, and as crises endure, this impact worsens. This analysis supports other evidence highlighting the trend that poverty is increasingly concentrated in crisis contexts. So this means that we need to address crisis in the poorest countries, but also that we need to address poverty in crisis contexts. And it reinforces the importance of initiatives like the OECD DAC Nexus recommendations that seek to make humanitarian development and peace-building responses to crisis more coherent. So, what's happening to volumes of international humanitarian assistance in response to this need? From 2014 to 2017, we saw the steady growth of assistance from governments, EU institutions, and private donors. So we reached a new high of 28.6 billion in 2017. The available data for 2018 shows that assistance continued to grow, but at a much slower pace. So from 2017 to 2018, international humanitarian assistance grew by just 1% to 28.9 billion in 2018. So slower growth in the last year, but I think it's also worth stepping back and looking across the 5 years of assistance that we capture in this chart. And actually what we see is growth of over 30% over that 5-year period. Also important to note that actually that growth has been driven roughly equally by increases in public contributions and contributions from private donors. So behind these figures, I think there are 2 key developments that are worth highlighting for 2018 in particular. The first, perhaps not a development so much, but a continuation of a trend, is that assistance continues to be concentrated from a small number of donors. What's notable this year, however, is that we see contributions from the 3 largest donors all reducing in 2018. So from the US, the largest donor by 6%, from Germany and the UK, both by 11%. We still see continued growth in international humanitarian assistance in aggregate because these reductions have been counterbalanced by significant rises from other states, and in particular 2 states in particular. So from the United Arab Emirates and from Saudi Arabia. So collectively, contributions from these 2 countries grew by $2.5 billion in 2018. So from total allocations from Saudi Arabia reached 2 billion, and total allocations from the United Arab Emirates reached 1.3 billion. What we know about these contributions is that they're very focused in response to a single crisis. So more than 90% of the assistance from Saudi Arabia and from the UAE was directed towards the response to the crisis in Yemen. So there's more international humanitarian assistance than ever before, even if it appears that that funding may be plateauing. Yet we also know that UN appeals are consistently underfunded. So as in 2017, only 61% of appeal requirements were met in 2018. So in this context, where the traditional humanitarian funding base hasn't really broadened or deepened, and crises are complex and protracted, the onus on developing and improving adaptive, long-term and flexible responses becomes ever more important. Indeed, that's really the vision that's been set out in the Grand Bargain that was agreed in 2016. I guess one of the challenges we have with looking at the Grand Bargain is that there's an absence of openly reported data on many of the areas of the Grand Bargain, and so assessing progress and impact is really challenging. One of the things that we've sought to do, and in particular focused on in this year's report, is to independently collect data. So we've collected it directly from donors, from UN agencies, INGOs and others, and we've sought to fill some of these gaps and provide some window on progress across these areas. So in this year's report, you'll be able to see new analysis on multi-year funding, unearmarked funding, localization, and cash transfer programming. So what do we see across these areas? So firstly, with the multi-year funding, since 2016, the volume of multi-year funding provided by donors to first level recipients has grown. So we see in the chart growth from 2.7 billion in 2016 up to 4.8 billion in 2018. So in 2018, this is accounting for 37% of all the humanitarian assistance from the donors from which we were able to collect data was multi-year funding. So this presents a pretty positive picture of progress. I think it's also worth noting, actually, just when we look at these contributions from government donors, that the majority of this funding, multi-year funding, is being directed towards UN agencies. So 71% of the funding in 2018 went to UN agencies. So yeah, as I say, a positive picture of progress, I think. However, we also collected data directly from UN agencies and INGOs. Over the same period, 2016 to 2018, this analysis shows that the proportion of total funding they received as multi-year funding grew, but in 2018 it still accounted for only 13% of their total funding. So there's a significant discrepancy between the 37% we see reported by donors and the 13% we see reported by first level recipients, UN agencies and INGOs. So in part, I suspect this discrepancy may stem from different conceptions of what constitutes multi-year funding. So it's definitely, I think, a priority. We develop a common language and we can provide greater clarity on what we mean when we talk about multi-year funding. Beyond this, I think it's also critical that we understand more about the efficiencies and results that multi-year funding can bring as it passes through the transaction chain. Increasingly, multi-year funding and unearmarked funding are referred to as key elements of quality funding. Indeed, the Grand Bargain work streams have been merged, and this is the new title of the work stream. Partly because these two funding can provide predictability and flexibility that implementers need to address the longer term, but also changing needs in crisis contexts. So what do we see then when we look at unearmarked funding? Again, data is limited, and we've directly collected data from 9 UN agencies and asked them to tell us the volumes of funding that they're receiving as unearmarked. What this shows is that the proportion of funding that they've received has continued to decline, or the proportion of funding that they've received as unearmarked, has continued to decline. So from 2015, where it was 20%, we've seen a gradual decline to 2018, where it's just 17% of their funding. As you can see from the chart, actually unearmarked funding by volume has increased slightly. So we see an increase from 2.2 billion in 2014 to 2.8 billion in 2018. However, this growth has been outstripped by greater increases in the volumes of earmarked funding. So the third area of the Grand Bargain that we have data on in this year's report relates to cash transfer programming. What we see here is a positive picture. This shows a 10% rise from 2017 to a total of 4.7 billion in 2018. Interestingly, our analysis shows that there's been a notable shift in how this cash programming is delivered. So implementers are increasingly favouring the use of cash rather than vouchers. In 2015, 55% of assistance was provided through cash, but this has risen to 78% in 2018. Finally, this year's report also provides some updated analysis on the volume of funding to local and national actors. This analysis shows a slight increase from 2.9% in 2017 to 3.1% in 2018 of total assistance being provided directly to local and national actors. So as we know, the definition that's been agreed for funding to local and national actors includes funding that's passed directly, of which we have a fairly good picture, but also funding that is passed through one intermediary, so that indirect funding. What we can see of this indirect funding is significantly more limited when we look at the global reporting platforms. What we can identify is only an additional 0.7% of funding passed indirectly. So we therefore have a global total of 3.8% directly and indirectly passed to local and national actors. However, we know that we're missing a big piece of the picture in relation to indirect funding, because the volume of flows that we can see at this second level is very limited in terms of the reporting. What we have done, however, working with Oxfam recently, is to conduct 2 studies in Uganda and Bangladesh, where we've sought to collect more comprehensive data on funding to local and national actors. What that shows is that the combined levels of direct and indirect funding in these 2 countries was 8% for Uganda and 9.7% for Bangladesh. So if these 2 countries are in some way indicative of what we see more broadly within the system, there's certainly more funding going to local and national actors than we can see reported on the global platforms. However, we're still some way short of the 25% target for 2020 that's been set within the Grand Bargain. So overall, looking at these areas of the Grand Bargain, I think what we see is a picture of mixed progress. Behind these figures, we also know that more evidence is needed on how best to target these forms of funding and on the impact that this funding is having. For the final part of my presentation, I want to share some of the analysis we have in this year's report that focuses on the wider crisis financing landscape. So looking at resources beyond humanitarian assistance to countries in crisis, those that could address humanitarian need, but also broader developmental and peace-building challenges. So we've looked at the mix of domestic and international resources to countries facing recurrent UN appeals in 2017 and compared them to other developing countries. For countries with recurrent crises, so this is what we can see in the slide, domestic resources per person are only a quarter of those to other developing countries. So just $272 per person compared with almost 1,000 in developing countries. While international flows per person are also very much smaller, about 40% lower in countries with recurrent crises than in other developing countries. In the report, we also look in more detail at trends in different aspects of this wider financing landscape. So we have some analysis on protracted crisis context, where we examine the relationship between developmental ODA, that ODA with a kind of a specifically developmental purpose, and compare that with humanitarian assistance. We also have analysis on the use of loans to countries in protracted crisis, and also analysis on the impact of crisis on the private sector in crisis contexts, and also the potential role and limitations of private sector engagement in crisis contexts. On this final point, we have looked at what happens to foreign direct investment across the first 5 years of a protracted crisis response. As the chart shows, for 27 countries that had experienced 5 or more years of UN coordinated appeals, foreign direct investment can be volatile and the inflows can fall rapidly in the face of a crisis. Indeed, foreign direct investment falls by on average 47% in the first year of crisis. We also have analysis in the report that shows that blended finance is very limited in protracted crisis contexts, but that the private sector, in particular, in this case, the banking and insurance sectors, may have more potential for positive impact through risk financing mechanisms, of which we also provide a mapping in the report. The final piece of analysis that I'd like to share relates to what we can see of humanitarian and development financing for disaster risk reduction. As we highlight in the report, of the 40 countries with the largest populations of people in need, almost half, 18, experienced disasters in 2018. With the impact of climate change intensifying, investing in disaster risk reduction becomes ever more critical. What we can see is that funding for disaster risk reduction grew by 25% between 2014 and 2017 to $10.4 billion US. Over this same period, more of this funding, both proportionally and by volume, is going to countries identified as being of high risk of natural hazard. So a positive picture. However, again, there's a caveat. The available data provides a slightly limited window on financing in this area, as the identifiable reporting captures a wide range of financing that potentially contributes to disaster risk reduction. What we do know positively, however, is that changes in reporting to the DAC mean that in future we should be able to more clearly identify the specific risk reduction intent of projects. So in summary, what do we see from our analysis of this year's GHA report? Firstly, humanitarian financing has grown, but growth has slowed, and it still remains inadequate to meet growing need. Secondly, there has been some progress in adapting to new ways of more efficient and effective programming. But this progress is mixed, pace of change is not sufficient, and there remain significant and fundamental gaps in reporting and evidence of impact. And thirdly, more broadly, new financing mechanisms are being developed and new sources of funding are being accessed. However, these need further development. Many are not yet operating to scale, and more evidence is needed of how to effectively target these, as well as on their impact. We also need to better understand how the range of humanitarian development and peace-building actors working in crisis contexts can collaborate more effectively together. As ever with the GHA report, we welcome feedback on our analysis, so please do get in touch if you have questions relating to any of the research in this year's report. I hope my brief presentation has laid some of the foundations for further discussions, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the presentations and discussion from our panelists. So thank you very much for your attention, and with that, I'll hand over to Sarah.
Thanks, Angus. So now, in response to Angus's presentation, I will highlight 3 overarching issues of relevance to financing across the humanitarian development peace nexus in protracted crises. Firstly, as we saw in our previous webinar and our analysis of broader humanitarian, non-humanitarian financing flows in the GHA report, development finance, both ODA and non-ODA, can play an important role in crisis contexts by addressing the root causes of poverty and vulnerability and the longer-term livelihood needs of affected populations. The sustained engagement and funding of development actors in pre, active and post-crisis phases is vital to building resilience and peace. Much of the focus on the Nexus to date has been within the humanitarian sector, but what needs to shift in the funding landscape to strengthen the role of development actors and establish a more unified, multi-stakeholder crisis response? This question is something that DI will explore further over upcoming months. Secondly, Angus's presentation demonstrates an increase in the volumes of multi-year humanitarian funding and cash transfers. Whilst multi-year funding can strengthen the predictability of humanitarian response, it is unlikely to deliver transformational change. Opportunities for multi-year humanitarian funding to go beyond addressing severe needs and cover longer-term livelihood programming is unrealistic in the context of finite humanitarian funding. This raises questions about the limitations of multi-year humanitarian funding and when and how best development actors can work collaboratively to fill this gap. Another ongoing dilemma is the relationship between multi-year and earmarked humanitarian funding. To offer quality funding, multi-year funding should, in theory, be flexible, yet financing trends in earmarked funding are not moving in this direction. So what needs to change to achieve this? And on cash transfers, whilst volumes are growing, there is limited reporting on the ways in which it is being directed, its impact and outcomes. For cash transfers to link to longer-term development programming, it will be important to explore opportunities for embedding cash beneficiary registration processes within national statistics systems. And thirdly, the GHA report provides an overview of current risk financing initiatives. Risk financing and other mechanisms which enable humanitarian and development agencies to scale up in response to new or intensified crisis, such as shock responsive programming and crisis modifiers, are an important aspect of approaching the Nexus through a linear or sequential approach. Though strengthening tools for supporting the transition from humanitarian assistance to recovery and peace building is equally important, though less progress has been made. Approaching the Nexus also requires agencies to work simultaneously, thinking and doing humanitarian development and peace programming all at the same time. More thought is required on how, for example, humanitarian programs, such as cash transfers, can be financed in a way that lay the foundations for social protection programs and early recovery, or how peace dividends, access to markets and livelihoods can be strengthened from the outset in parallel to humanitarian programs. That draws to a close our presentation from DI. So Harpinder, I will now hand back to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you very much, Angus. I'm aware that some people are having slight difficulties with the audio, and I'm aware also that the presentations were quite fast and difficult to keep up with. So as I said at the start of the conversation, we will make sure that the presentations are sent out with the mail out. You will see all the slides there and have the chance to go through them in more depth. Again, if you've got questions specifically about the data we've presented on the GHA report, if you send those through, we will deal with them separately, but we'll try to keep the questions today largely focused on the next two presentations that are coming up from Jeremy and from Marta. So we will try to deal with those questions separately and get back to each of the people who have put those questions forward, particularly if they're around the data side as well. But thank you very much, both some very important questions and areas highlighted there. So I'm going to move on to Jeremy now and introduce Jeremy who's the Senior Policy Fellow at CGD. Jeremy focuses on humanitarian response and reform, US aid policy reform and global outbreaks and preparedness. He's previously served in the Obama administration from 2013 to 2017 as the Director of the USAID's Office of US Foreign Disaster Assistance. He is currently a member of the World Health Organization's High-Level Independent Oversight and Advisory Committee, which oversees the agency's health emergency program. So again, as we start to hear from Jeremy, I would ask every single person listening, if you've got questions, please can you put those into the box, and then we will collate them together after the presentations have been through and then be able to answer them. Thank you so much, and handing over to Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Harpinder. Are you all able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Jeremy.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much. So thank you so much to DI for inviting me to join this webinar today, and congratulations on the release of the report. It is as always a really excellent resource and something that I've certainly drawn on in my current work and my past work. If we could go to the next slide. There we go. So this is a quote, and I think it's very relevant to the conversation we're having here today about the Nexus and how humanitarian and other forms of financing work together. So this is a quote from Antonio Guterres at the World Economic Forum earlier this year, where he said, global challenges are more and more integrated and the responses are more and more fragmented. And if this is not reversed, it's a recipe for disaster. Now, he was talking about a range of things, but I think that really captures something essential about the nature of the humanitarian landscape and humanitarian financing, both in terms of kind of just specifically and strictly the humanitarian sector, but also in terms of how the humanitarian sector interacts and interfaces with development and peace actors. If we could go to the next slide. So we see a number of trends now in humanitarian response. I'm seeing a few comments about the audio being poor. Is this any better now?
Jeremy, we can hear you. I know a few people are struggling with audio, but it seems like it's very much dependent on each individual person's, potentially their bandwidth and their internet cutting in and out. So it seems that we can actually hear you perfectly clearly, but if you just project, I think we'll be okay.
I will do my best. All right.
Thank you.
And apologies if I end up sounding a bit like I'm shouting, but I'll try to project. So we have these trends in the humanitarian sector that are pushing humanitarian work towards greater integration on a few fronts. Multi-purpose cash being one. The use of cash programming that transcends the ways that we typically organize and typically finance humanitarian assistance. Cutting across the clusters, cutting across individual agencies and the mandates of individual agencies. And we don't really have a good way of doing that right now and financing that through our normal channels. Multi-sector programming is another. Multi-sector work is not just limited to cash. There are other forms of programming that need to cut across different sectors and different agencies, and the systems we have right now are not very effective at enabling that and incentivizing that. Of course, the triple nexus, which has already been discussed, is proving to be a struggle in terms of financing and implementation. Then things like joint needs analysis and feedback and accountability mechanisms. All of these are things that require us as humanitarian actors to work across the institutions and across the funding channels and the different kind of organizational boxes that we are used to and accustomed to operating within. And so, integration may be the future of effective humanitarian action, but it is being held back by these kind of old, sometimes outdated legacy structures that we are still operating within. If I could go to the next slide, please. And so the next few slides look at why this is so difficult. And this is from a report that I published a few years ago on the what I termed the humanitarian business model. And this shows a rough proportional breakdown from the OCHA Financial Tracking Service of the funding that FTS captures and where it's going and to what sort of organization it's going. And so what you see here, and this is 2017, but most years look quite like this. The big three UN agencies receive roughly half of the official donor financing in the humanitarian system. That's World Food Program, UNHCR, and UNICEF. The rest of the UN system gets about another 10%. The Red Cross movement gets about another 10%. A few percent go to pooled funds. NGOs get about 25%. And then national governments and local NGOs and other groups get a pretty negligible volume of money. So when you look at this, it's clear you've got some organizations and some sectors that are doing very, very well out of this current financing arrangement, and I think that's quite germane to thinking about incentives for reform. If we could go to the next slide. So, as DI has also said, there has been a massive increase in humanitarian financing over about the last 20 years. So, it's gone up 3 to 4, even now if you go to 2019, probably 5 times greater than it was in the early 2000s. So a massive increase from international donors. And it's fair to ask, given that over that period we've had 3 major rounds of reform, the reforms that Jan Egeland initiated in 2005 and 6, the transformative agenda in 2011 and 12, and then of course the grand bargain in 2016 and 17. Is there any evidence that over that time period donors have been making different choices about how they invest money based on these reform priorities? If we could go to the next slide. So this shows that same data set, but as a proportional allocation rather than the total volume of money. And so what you see from this data is that really there has not been, at least through the years immediately following the grand bargain, there's very little indication that donors were making any significant adjustments to their proportional allocation of funding based on the reform commitments. So the only year that you see a really significant shift in the proportional availability of funding is 2005, when there is that major spike in funding to the NGO sector and a proportional decline in funding to the big 3 UN agencies. But I think everyone on this call will recognize that was the year of the tsunami, the Indian Ocean tsunami, when there was a huge increase in private giving to NGOs. And the following year, things reverted back to more or less the normal traditional proportion. So basically, over this whole past now 2 decades, where we have been working on various efforts to try and reform and improve the coherence of the humanitarian system, there's been very little change in donor behavior. The same basic donors are continuing to give the same basic proportions of funding to the same agencies to do much the same things, as they were 15 or 20 years ago. And so it's and in ever larger amounts every year. And so it's in that sense perhaps not so surprising that that the reform commitments that we have all collectively made on paper have not translated into fundamental changes in how the humanitarian system operates, because ultimately, you know, a large bureaucracy is going to be guided as much by its funding incentives as by anything else. Now, I will add the caveat that since I published this paper about a year and a half ago, I think there is some evidence emerging now that the grand bargain is beginning to have more of an impact on donor behavior than some of the past reforms did, particularly with things like cash and multi-year financing, both of which are increasing as a proportion of overall funding. But still, I think the basic point holds, which is that what the grand bargain has done, and similarly what the transformative agenda and earlier reforms did, was really double down on the basic financial architecture of the system, not changing how funding flows and the incentives that go along with that, but rather just trying to make it more flexible and more efficient. And I think it's notable too that the slide that DI presented earlier on earmarking, it also shows that there are some important ways in which donor behavior is not changing even under the grand bargain. So yes, multi-year is increasing, cash is increasing, but earmarking, which is supposed to be reduced under the grand bargain, is actually not declining. As a proportion, it's actually increasing, which is sort of the opposite of what the grand bargain was supposed to deliver. If we could go to the next slide. And so the basic conclusion of some of my research is that you know, under the current system, fragmentation really is the core business model. Donor practices and the ways in which major agencies raise their money is all centered around and reinforces core institutional incentives and power dynamics that are inherently fragmented. And they work against greater coherence across sectors and across agencies. So the basic UN agency business model is a vertically siloed, one-stop shop, if you will, multilateral agency in which each large agency acts effectively as its own pooled fund. So you know, we have now the SURF, we have country-based pooled funds, but in effect, if you think about the role that a large multilateral agency plays, it is a pooled fund for its own program. So the World Food Program is in effect the global pooled fund for food programs. The UNHCR is in effect the global pooled fund for refugee support, and so on and so forth. And so we are, you know, by donors, by working in this way, reinforce the segmentation across you know, between the agencies, and they make they do not incentivize them to collaborate, because the way that you raise your money if you are a UN agency is you go and advocate for your mandate to donors. You do not compete necessarily on performance. You compete on who is the best at selling their mandate. And then the way we build response plans and appeals reinforces this, because of course those come up through the clusters, which are led by these same agencies. The clusters are organized around the technical sectors that align with the kind of the major program areas of the large multilateral agency. And so that too, the way we build response plans further reinforces this fragmentation. And then the coordination architecture is also built around that. So we, you know, within how we coordinate humanitarian assistance, it is all through the major technical sectors. It is not on, you know, a thematic basis or a geographic basis, but rather it is around the food sector, the wash sector, the health sector, the shelter sector, the protection sector. And that is where the principal operational coordination happens. And that too makes it harder to then coordinate and align activity across those different elements, much less between this coordination architecture we have on the humanitarian side and the you know, development work and the peace building work that may be going on in the same context. So this is not a system that talks to itself very well, much less talks to other sectors very well. And I think a last important point on this, on why it continues to be financed this way, is that donors are, for the most part, very, very reliant on this system to inform their own funding decisions. So very few donors have their own ability to analyze or validate needs. They have very little ability to second guess or sort of objectively verify program priorities and program strategy or evaluate performance. And so they are heavily reliant on major UN agencies and on the clusters to set the technical standards for programs, to operate the programs that implement those technical standards, and then to assess how effectively they have met the standards that they have set through the programs that they have led. So there is not really an honest broker built into that arrangement, and the system in effect audits its own performance. If we could have the next slide. So I think that, against the backdrop of that inherently fragmented traditional business model, it's easier to understand why we haven't seen more progress over the last 15 to 20 years in terms of effectiveness and coherence in the humanitarian system. And so we are at CGD developing a few ideas to try and address this by changing how funding flows. So not to look at how much money is going into the system, but rather how is it being organized and what do agencies have to do to get it. One of the ideas that we are developing is to turn country-based pooled funds into the core, or at least a core means of financing responses. So right now, country-based pooled funds are a sort of a small boutique financing function. They fill gaps, but they don't finance the core of a response. The core of the response funding still goes through the big agencies. And that incentivizes the agencies to each develop their own direct relationships and directly advocate with donors as the way they get their funding, rather than to work through a common collective strategy. So it doesn't necessarily incentivize collective outcomes. If, on the other hand, a significant percentage, say 25 to 30% of the financing in a given crisis context were flowing through the pooled fund, that would be a significant enough source of funding. That would be equivalent to one of the largest, if not the largest donor to that crisis. Then all of the humanitarian actors in that crisis would need to take it seriously, and it would give a lot more leverage and a lot more power to the collective planning process. And it would, the humanitarian coordinator and the humanitarian country team would be able to use that to turn the humanitarian response plans from what are right now really fundraising documents into an actual serious planning process. The second idea is to construct those response plans and appeals on the basis of activities rather than projects, and to prioritize funding across those activities and prioritize tranches of funding. So, right now, the way that an appeal is built and the way that contributions against an appeal are measured is all around whether the specific individual projects that are listed in the appeal are financed. And this was, when I was a donor at USAID, this was always very frustrating, because we would almost always fund in a way that was aligned with the strategic objectives of the appeal, but that didn't mean we were going to fund the specific projects listed in the appeal. We might prefer to fund a WASH program directly to an NGO rather than routing that funding through UNICEF, for example. And if that NGO were not the listed partner in the appeal, then our funding would be considered outside the appeal, even though in effect, it was supporting the humanitarian response plan. You could get around that by structuring plans on the basis of activity-based costing. So not listing specific projects, but putting in estimates of the total resources available, irrespective of who gets the funding to implement that. And that would give, I think, a much more accurate and honest view of how fully individual crises are actually being financed. Because frankly, as a donor, I would almost ignore the the advocacy from the UN about the percentage of coverage of a response plan, because I knew that a lot of the funding I was putting into that very country was not being counted in that figure. The other thing that this would enable is to prioritize levels of funding within an appeal, so that rather than just putting all of these individual projects in and in effect saying they're all equally important, which is how most appeals are currently constructed, the humanitarian country team and the humanitarian coordinator could say, okay, the most urgent 25% of funding should go towards this set of strategic activities. The next most urgent 25% should go towards this. And that too would enable a different way of looking at crisis financing, because we could look at not just what proportion of the appeal is being covered, but also what proportion of the most urgent needs are being covered and what proportion of the next most urgent needs are being covered. And that, I think, would give much greater comparability of the level of funding against need across different crises. Two other ideas here. In terms of multi-year financing, as we begin to look at ways to better align humanitarian planning and development planning, it's going to be important to amortize costs. So, if we continue to look at humanitarian programs only in terms of their impact on a one-year timeline and their costs on a one-year timeline, that's going to leave out a lot of activities that would make sense if we take a longer view. So, for example, a preparedness program might not deliver impact in the first year, but it might deliver significant impact on a 3 or 5 year timeline. Well, if the costs are heavily weighted towards the beginning of that program and the benefits are only coming in the last 3, 4, or 5 years, 3, 4, or 5, we need a better way in appeals of anticipating that and financing in a way that unlocks that. And so, we would propose that appeals should begin including 3 and 5 year outlooks, and propose to donors financing that kind of breaks down the cost of that upfront investment over a longer time period that is better aligned with the payoff. Because then, something like investing in local capacity building might not make sense if you're only looking 12 months out, but 5 years down the road, if there is a much stronger cadre of local humanitarian organizations that can take on delivery, well, that's a great benefit. But to get that benefit, to unlock that benefit, you need to look over that 5 year timeline and structure the costing accordingly. Last idea here, and it's almost more of a question than an idea, but within cash programming now, there is this growing consensus that cash should be delivered independent of the mandates or the sectors of any individual agency or program. And so about a year ago, OCHA, UNICEF, UNHCR, and World Food Program all signed a joint letter committing to move towards multi-sector cash delivered through a single program, because that is the most effective way to deliver cash programming, rather than segmenting it according to the respective mandates or sectors of each individual agency. And I think that that's absolutely the right move, and I really commend them for doing that, although I'm sure it is going to be complex to execute. But I think it raises a very natural question, which is, if we can do that for cash, and if that is the most effective way to deliver cash, why shouldn't we be doing that for other programs as well? There are very few programs that are most effective within the boundaries of one individual sector or one individual agency. And so I think we need to think more creatively about program delivery platforms that are also independent of agency or independent of sector, just as we've now recognized cash should be. Next slide. Okay, and this is my final. I was really struck looking at the GHA slides a few days ago at how little movement there has been on local financing. And I think that this points up an important reality, which is I suspect that using large international organizations as funding intermediaries between donors and local organizations is probably inevitable. I don't think there's a way around that. Speaking from my own background as a donor, and I ran an organization that had a lot of bandwidth, a lot of staff. We still had to give our money out in portions, ranging between 3 to 5 million to 10 to 20 million. And most donors have to give out their money in those kinds of volumes to allocate the money that they have. Well, when you're giving money out in those volumes, that limits the kind of the number of organizations that have the global absorptive capacity to take on those sorts of volumes of funding, particularly to take on those volumes across multiple countries. And so administering funding to local organizations is probably not something that major institutional donors could have or will ever have the administrative capacity to do. And just as a reality, they would not have the ability to give out a larger volume of smaller grants that would reflect at least the existing absorptive capacity of local groups. So I think that using international groups as some sort of an intermediary layer is probably inevitable, and I think that's what is being reflected in the data that we saw in the slides earlier. What I think is not inevitable is that those international organizations should then be the first resort implementers of that programming. So, right now, if money goes to an international NGO or to a UN agency from a donor, it's that organization that then has the discretion to decide, okay, are we going to implement this program directly, or are we going to sub it out, subgrant it to a local partner? I think that could be inverted. And so, there's this interesting trend over the last few years in constrained access environments like Syria or Somalia, that we are increasingly seeing a sort of umbrella partnership model where UN agencies and international NGOs administer money and provide technical oversight, but local partner groups actually lead on the delivery. And I think that's a good thing. It's being done in effect by necessity because international groups can't keep a footprint there. But I think it's worth questioning then if that's something that we can do collectively in the toughest of operating environments, why couldn't that be the default implementation approach everywhere? Why should international NGOs and UN agencies continue doing frontline implementation in a place like Kenya or a place like Tanzania or Uganda or Congo if they are able to work through and cultivate local partners in other environments? And I think that would take some changes to NGO and UN operating models, and it would take donors pushing them in that direction. But I think that that's the conversation we need to begin having around localization, not who gets the frontline money, but rather, not who gets the money directly from donors, but rather who is getting the money to do the frontline delivery and through what channel is that flowing, and what value add does this intermediary layer between the donors and the frontline implementers play, given that it is probably inevitable to have some sort of intermediary. And I think that is it for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Some fantastic new ideas in your presentation, which I'm sure we'll pick up in the discussion. Very interesting. I'm going to introduce Marta now, but just so everybody online is aware, we do not have a PowerPoint slide, so you will be listening to Marta, but you won't be seeing any slides, just so you're aware. And so I'm going to introduce Marta Rudis. Marta was appointed Deputy Special Representative of the UN Assistant Mission for Iraq and as UN Humanitarian Coordinator in 2018. She's previously served as UN Resident Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator in Sudan, UNDP Country Director in Afghanistan, and as UN Deputy Special Coordinator, Resident Coordinator, and UNDP Resident Representative in Lebanon. She has more than 27 years of experience in coordinating UN development and humanitarian work in conflict and post-conflict countries, as well as supporting peace-building transitions. So it's great to have Marta here with us today and hear much more from her on a on-the-ground perspective of what it's like to actually be working with the UN on the ground, delivering some of the humanitarian assistance. Marta, over to you.
Thanks very much. And I'm actually very glad to be following Jeremy's presentation, because I think some of the ideas that he floated are very much in line with what I would like to argue for. So the first thing that I would like to maybe address is we've been talking about a number of terms, flexibility, coherence, and the Nexus, predictability. I don't think that all of these are always possible to be implemented together. If we look, for example, towards flexibility versus coherence, we as a collective of the international community are even currently in this presentation discussing a lot of the instruments that we are using to develop humanitarian assistance. But these instruments, although they are attempting to address the flexibility issue, in fact, very often constrain flexibility. So if we think of some of these big pooled funds that were developed in order to address longer term needs, or some of the ones that development initiatives mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. The famine response, some of these big pooled funds at the headquarters level, they represent, from a country perspective, an earmarked addition to the overall financing flows. And it's very, very difficult to insert them into a coherent country level response. In fact, headquarters or capital-based or capital-managed funding often is very difficult to insert into a coherent response. So I would just like to have us all consider very carefully when we talk about flexibility, when we talk about coherence, and how this inserts itself into a country level response. And what I would like to argue for most strongly is the need for a contextualized response. In this sense, I very much like Jeremy's approach to country-based pool funds as the sort of core vehicle for financing a response, because it does provide for a contextualized mechanism for country level response, and one that could very well be used as an instrument that is not siloed, as Jeremy described in his presentation. But another thing that I would like to say is that we often don't seem to have a common picture of what we are talking about when we refer to the Nexus. It's very unclear in terms of what is it that we are being asked to finance, what is the scope, within a given context, what does it include, or are we talking about the same thing everywhere? It often seems to me, from the perspective of a country response, that we are given one sort of very neat package that needs to be implemented within the context, regardless of the context. And, you know, if I take the last country that I served in, Sudan, and the current one, Iraq, they are hugely different contexts where the Nexus in its application is very, very different. In Sudan, you had a protracted crisis with predominantly humanitarian financing, where, because of historical constraints, that humanitarian financing was flexibilized to its maximum extent, but where it was absolutely necessary to start to build the connections with development funding, development response that hadn't been done in the past. Whereas in Iraq, you have a post-conflict situation where development financing was starting straight off the bat, and the immediate humanitarian needs were reducing. So the Nexus response was relatively focused, or is relatively focused, on durable solutions for IDPs. It's a fairly restrictive Nexus application, which would very much respond to the focusing that Jeremy was leading towards, as opposed to in Sudan, where Nexus applied almost across the board. So you need a very, very flexible application of, Nexus, whatever that might mean. But I don't think that we have sufficiently well developed the definition of what a Nexus is, of what might be prioritized, of how it might be implemented, of who is meant to be participating in its implementation and its definition. And, we need to be very clear if we are to avoid sort of being held accountable for unrealistic expectations. Having said that, I think that one of the more important things to do moving forward is to move away from a focus on instruments for financing and towards something that is more a definition and an accountability mechanism for collective outcomes. Something, by the way, that we also have enough defined. So collective outcomes mean very different things across a variety of different countries where they have been applied to a greater or lesser extent. But I think if I go back to Sudan, we had tried to define collective outcomes very broadly, so that they would include the government, the donors, the UN agencies, the NGOs, and the private sector. So it was a broad tent, if you like, that tried very much to identify common, strategic, transformative objectives for the medium to long term, within which humanitarian financing also folded in. If you have that, if you are able to have that, which is not easy in and of itself, then I think it would be easier to ensure that we are following what Jeremy, for example, was talking about in terms of activity-based financing. I would call it more results-based financing that cut across humanitarian, development, and peace objectives, because those have been identified collectively ex ante, have been prioritized, and where the financing streams that are contributing to that are identified and benchmarks are identified. Now, that's not easy to do. Data sources, monitoring, and so on is very difficult in these countries. And in particular, if we're talking about crisis countries, these are those countries where typically capacities are least well developed. And so it's very difficult for the government to take the ownership that would ensure that this sustainability in the medium to long term. But I think that kind of approach is the only way that would allow us collectively to try to deliver on the Nexus, on the grand bargain agreements, and on results on the ground. And it would allow us to incorporate the kind of fragmented financing streams that we have just been hearing persist and have persisted for years, despite a variety of different initiatives that have attempted to build in greater coherence into the system. My feeling, very much as Jeremy has mentioned, is that the incentive structures are just making it impossible to go against this kind of persistent fragmentation. And so we have to try to develop mechanisms that work with that fragmentation to deliver coherence, although that sounds a little bit contradictory. And I think the best way is to really define a way to work towards these collective outcomes, to really define them well as having genuine impact, being genuinely strategic. And then it would not necessarily matter if the funding streams come from a variety of different directions, as long as the outcomes are the same and are agreed to be the same. Having said that, I think it would be very, very important to have something like the country-based pooled funds to provide a core of financing that is driving the process. It's been my experience in the various different countries that I've served in that country-based pooled funds, although the funding percentage of the total is very small, they do have a larger impact, a larger bang for the buck, if you like, per fund than they would normally have just by driving the discussion, by initiating sort of areas of work that others might not be willing to engage in. And so driving a core financing mechanism that can have a genuine transformative role that is coordinating, I think would have a multiplying effect on the rest of the funding in that country. So that's, I think, some of the more important issues, but I would argue somewhat against headquarters-based or capital-based sort of pooled funding mechanisms. Not in general. I think they are useful in certain limited areas, but from the country perspective, they represent thematical earmarking, and the dynamic of being managed from the capital or headquarters often intersects in very perverse ways with country-based prioritization. So, you know, for example, the SURF is something that is still working very much against this multi-year financing, the Nexus financing. It's very, very restrictive to not just humanitarian, but emergency response. So it's difficult, not to say impossible, to use SURF funding for Nexus type initiatives. You cannot, for example, build a sustainable structure, but with SURF funding, you're left rebuilding the same school year after year from non-sustainable materials, which is quite perverse in many ways. And that is what ends up happening with headquarters-based pooled funding. The other thing that I would talk about perhaps is the discussion that often takes place about the inclusion of IFIs, which I think is critical at one end of the nexus, more towards development, but their presence is increasingly being driven at the humanitarian end of the Nexus programming, where they often work through budget support and on reform issues that are very, very difficult to integrate with some of the humanitarian imperatives. And yet there's often a drive to use IFI funding for that purpose. So I would just put that out there, that I think it's very, very difficult sometimes to work on humanitarian financing with IFI funding. Okay, maybe I'll just leave it there because I'm aware that we are almost reaching the end.
Great, Marta. Thank you so much. But very important and useful perspective, and it really adds to the ideas that Jeremy has introduced as well. Before we start to respond to the questions that have been coming in through the webinar functionality, I just wanted to bring in Amy Dodd, who is our head of engagement and also leads on our development financing discussions, because it's really essential that we get a perspective from a development finance perspective as well, and actually where the discussions are around the nexus ideas amongst development actors, and particularly in the financing space, but also how realistic it is for development actors to deliver in these commitments too. Amy, can I bring you in?
Thanks, Harpinder. Yeah, I'd agree. It's obviously an incredibly challenging question. I think one of the biggest things that I've noticed, and as you said, as someone who does work much more on the development finance side, is we don't really see this as part of our core job. So we talk about the Nexus, we are familiar with that language and that kind of framing, and we talk about how much poverty and inequality are kind of concentrating, particularly in more fragile contexts, but it hasn't really changed the way we approach things. And I think we really still see it as the job of kind of crisis actors, if we're honest, of humanitarian actors. And that to me feels like a really fundamental kind of mindset shift that development actors need to change the way they think about that. You know, working in crisis, working in humanitarian contexts is not just someone else's job, it's got to be core to how we approach our jobs as well. I think the point Sarah made about thinking differently about how we approach the financing of this stuff around, not kind of that we flip in to humanitarian when a crisis hits and then we go back to development. That's a very sort of old school way of thinking about it, but that we need to be thinking about, you know, less transition and more kind of concurrent scaling up and down. You know, we shouldn't lose the kind of the interesting and unique things we've learned about different ways of financing and different approaches, but equally we really need to stop seeing them in silos. I think, as I said, that there's a really big challenge for ourselves to kind of think differently about how we do stuff. I know Marta and Jeremy are both talking about the localization agenda, and I think that's one where both in a development context and clearly in a humanitarian one, we've really struggled to deliver on that, and yet we know ownership, leadership by people living and affected by these crises, or you know, people living in countries is really critical to doing development well. I think one big thing that we can be doing on the development end, and probably a space where we've seen some success, is really thinking much more in the long term, thinking about prevention, thinking about resilience or resilient kind of programs. One example I hear brought up a lot is around the social protection programming in Ethiopia that, you know, over the last 5 to 10 years has really seen, you know, some really big impacts in terms of their resilience to a crisis when it emerges. So actually that was a lot of development programming that was really leading to better humanitarian outcomes as well, I think. So yeah, there's some very big systemic changes. I think the points that you're making, Marta, about the challenges of more or less flexible funding are definitely there. Some donors are set up that way and some aren't. So I think there's definitely space there where we could be improving the way we approach that. I think one big challenge we're going to have as well is, you know, for a lot of donors, they're not kind of well set up to think about the nexus, and a lot of them are wary of engaging more in these contexts, particularly with the kind of longer term development programming or much more locally owned interventions, partially because they're very risk averse. And I think getting over that barrier is going to be a fairly fundamental one.
Thank you, Amy. That's a really helpful intervention to bring into the conversation from the development perspective. And I just wanted to sort of pick up on a question we've got coming in, which is for Jeremy, first of all. and it's coming in from Barnaby Willits King, and it's also something that's really coming to the top of my mind as well, that actually a lot of the ideas, Jeremy, that you're putting forward here today, it's great to see them in your presentation, but we've been listening and hearing about them for a while now, and particularly the one with regards to the incentives around the current structures that we've got at the UN aren't necessarily set up to deal with the crisis of today or tomorrow, and the structures are actually inhibiting rather than allowing us to work in a much more coordinated way. But one of the questions that Barnaby's got is, great to see these ideas coming forward. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what is actually preventing them from being implemented as well?
Sure. Thanks for that. And I did see Barnaby raise that question in the chat while I was presenting. I think it's a really important question. It's something that we are exploring in an ongoing dialogue that that CGD is convening with leaders in the donor community. So I think a couple of dynamics are at play here. One is that, you know, those bandwidth limitations that I spoke of earlier, they don't just prevent donors from giving more money to local groups. They also, you know, they are part of the reason why donors are so heavily reliant on UN agencies, because donors, for the most donors, do not have the ability to do significant direct programming of their financing. So they have to find a way to pool it. They have to pool it in some way in order to program it. And so what the UN agencies in their traditional model offer are very convenient ways for donors to pool their funding and to shift the kind of the cost and the burden of administering that money over onto the UN agencies rather than keeping it on the donor side. Now, not every donor uses that model. OFDA, where I used to work, and ECHO, and to some extent DFID, do have the bandwidth to do more direct project grant making, but most donors don't. And so I think that has been a limiting factor, and that is why I see the country-based pooled fund reforms as potentially a really powerful way around that. Because what country-based pooled funds do is they give donors the means to pool funding, not around the basis of agency or mandate or sector, but rather on the basis of an individual crisis. And to fully capitalize on that, though, we need to think about country-based pooled funds in a different way. And there's been an interesting natural experiment going on in Yemen for the past little more than a year, where the very large contributions from the Gulf donors, which of course come with their own baggage and have not always been consistent, but when they do come through, those large grants on the order of $500 million to $1 billion are going as in effect, a large block grant to the response plan, not individual grants to individual agencies. And so that has enabled the humanitarian coordinator and the humanitarian country team to actually finance the response plan as if it were an actual plan, rather than financing, rather than just using that as a sort of fundraising pitch document to support donors as they give money to individual agencies. And so, I think that model has a lot of potential. And when I have talked with donors about it, there's been quite a lot of excitement about exploring how some of the how a country-based pooled fund could be reimagined to play a more core role, and kind of what opportunities that might open up for them. But the donors ultimately right now have to finance into the things that exist. And so within the current architecture, the things that kind of the opportunities that they have for financing are fairly traditional. I think there is a lot of merit in expanding, and this is something we're working on proposing, expanding a more block grant sort of approach to country-based pooled funds that would create a new opportunity or kind of new avenue for donors to channel their funding. The other thing I think is just, there is a lot of inertia and a lot of turnover in the donor community, and donors don't always kind of recognize or appreciate the incentives that they are creating with the ways in which they allocate their funding. And so, the dialogue that we have been convening with the donor community has been really, really interesting, as I think some of the participants in that are beginning to better appreciate that some of their traditional funding practices are creating incentives that they don't intend. But I don't think that's something that donors have always recognized necessarily. So I think that, partly there's a structural gap here, and partly there's a sort of an awareness or an informational gap.
Great, thank you so much, Jeremy. I've got a comment actually from Richard Blewett, who's been listening as well. Is there a way to put in place at scale well-funded, long-term, rigorous external strategic monitoring alongside scaled country pool funds? We're not going to address and answer these right now, but there's lots of very good ideas and thoughts coming through on the questions. I did want to put a specific question to Marta. I'm aware we've got 5 more minutes to go, and I don't want to take the liberty of extending into people's time. So Marta, I'd like to bring you in for a final question before we wrap up, and then we can try to summarize some of these questions into the mail out and address them through that way. So Marta, there's a question around blending various funding streams to deliver collective outcomes, that this is a great way to go, but it relies on a huge amount of agreement to collaborate. So that's very much a political process that needs to happen in the first place to actually get us there. And unfortunately, because of the competition within the system, it's very hard to find where the incentives are for collaboration, and also who then becomes accountable for the delivery of the collective outcome. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and views on that. And it's quite a complex question, I'm afraid, but over to you.
Thanks. It is a little bit complex, but just to get a little bit into it, I would caution against overstating the competition. There's no doubt that the incentive structure does drive towards competition within the UN system. When I was talking about collective outcomes, I was talking about them on a far broader way than just the UN system, including also the national government and the donors in country and the NGOs and the private sector. We may not always be able to get all of those actors around the table, but once you do, and I think it is generally possible to reach an agreement on strategic objectives when you are familiar with the needs, the context of the country, then I think, you reach that agreement, and there's a little bit of a collective accountability built into the mechanism. So I think if you're able to have the data to monitor achievement or partial achievement or progress towards those collective outcomes, then I think, there is a mutual accountability that can be built in. I don't think we have enough evidence base to say whether that can be successful or not, because I think we're just starting along that path, but I think it could work. Back to you guys.
Great. Thank you, Marta. I think that's a really important point, and I think there's a lot of unknowns here as well. We've got one question around the grand bargain, and obviously the slides that Angus was showing, the one that always gets people's attention is the small amount of money that flows down to the local level. And obviously we've got the grand bargain target of 25% to local actors by next year. And we're very far from that according to the data that we've got. And I think we have to be very clear in the data that we can track. So my final question is to both Jeremy and to Marta with regards to a potential idea from Fergus Thomas on a subcontracting model. He's saying that the subcontracting model is defunct, and the country-based pool funds are an important part of that story, but can't do some of the more creative brainstorming on multi-donor platforms that are designed exactly to shift that power to local actors. So, where are the opportunities beyond the country-based pooled funds that we could be using now to go further in getting funding down to the local actors? Jeremy, should we start with you first?
Sure. No, I think that's a great question from Fergus, and it's something that we're thinking about a lot at CGD. We've had some interesting dialogue with with local NGOs and with some of the near network leadership on this very question. And I think one of the things that comes through is that the country-based pooled funds, as they are currently organized, are not really set up effectively to support local organizations. They can do it a little bit on the margins, but they're not well adapted to that sort of a funding approach. And so, some of the things that would need to happen, and I think that with changes, the country-based pooled funds could conceivably play that role, and that could be one way to go. I think it would also be possible for donors to develop other pooled mechanisms that would be more specifically focused on the needs of local organizations. But some of the things that I think need to happen, one is more of a streamlining of qualifications. So right now, if a local organization wants to seek funding, whether it's from a pooled fund or an international NGO or a UN agency, each of those different types of organizations, and frequently each different individual organization, will have its own due diligence requirements and kind of eligibility requirements for a local partner, and those will be different each time. And so it creates a huge burden on local partners to qualify or to demonstrate eligibility for funding. So I think that's something that really urgently needs to be standardized and streamlined. Another is to ensure that indirect costs and overhead costs are being paid. There are many, whether it's through a pooled fund or an international intermediary organization, often the level of indirect cost support that an international organization will receive is far higher than what a local organization will receive. And so, just take one example. I don't mean to pick on UNHCR here, but I'm going to pick on UNHCR. So when they fund an international NGO, the indirect cost is 8%, and when they fund a local, it's 4%. And so, that actually makes life considerably harder for a local organization. Another really important point is that there needs to be investment in capacity, and that's rarely built into these sort of intermediary platforms. So a truly well adapted funding platform for a local group, for local organizations, would include not just project funding and overhead, but also specific resources available for capacity development. So I think there are ways to develop some of these platforms to better serve that purpose, but fully agree with Fergus that they're at the moment they're not really in place adequately.
Thank you, Jeremy. Marta, would you like to comment at all?
Yeah, I think, like everything else, it also has to be very contextualized, because in the context, for example, of Iraq, where NGOs as a mechanism, really, as an institution, is relatively recent, you have very little capacity built into the national NGO structure. And so what we found is that there's a little bit of a contradiction between the localization agenda and the accountability that we need to have in terms of fiduciary responsibility. So I think, I very much support the idea of trying to build in the institutional development and institutional support into any mechanism that we develop as a result of trying to respond to the localization agenda, because the way that currently the financing is going, mostly on an annualized basis, is very difficult for NGOs to think to the future. And when I say the future, it can be just next year. And so very difficult for them to build their own capacity, let alone try to build that into the overall framework, the planning framework that we are developing. So I think there's something with regard to how the donors build in the thinking towards the financing and their own response going into the financing stream. I would also say that one of the important things is that in the grand bargain, there are other streams like simplifying reporting requirements and so on that would very much help to build national NGO presence and institutionality that I don't think has been well enough developed as yet. Having said that, I think that the country-based pooled funds are, as of now, one of the better mechanisms for localization, as far as I have been able to see, including in particular in Iraq, where even though I am saying that it's very difficult to ensure that accountability is maintained, we still have been able to build up the percentage of local NGOs that are receiving funding through the pooled fund over the past 2-3 years to nearly 75% now. So it really is one of the only mechanisms that local NGOs have to access the kind of capacity, the kind of institutionality that they require in order to build up their presence and their capacities.
It's a very complex issue with regards to the localization agenda, and also managing the capacity, the ability of local NGOs to be able to receive money, but also having the ability to actually then deliver the services and respond to reporting requirements of donors. And this is an area that is not necessarily just unique to the humanitarian space and humanitarian actors. It's a wider discussion that's happening across the board. And I think it's really important. Maybe this is where some of those connections around the Nexus can really be helpful as well. Ultimately, the shift in power from the global north, large NGOs, to the southern NGOs is a big topical conversation and a very important one. And actually, it needs to be expedited to ensure faster results on the ground level as well. One of the things that's been considered in there is also the role of philanthropist in supporting that. So there's an idea being floated around private equity type of funding for NGOs, in-country NGOs, that covers course costs, covers the costs that wouldn't otherwise be covered in programmatic funding as well. So is there new models that can be developed to help support and build capacity of small and medium-sized actors at the country level as well? So loads of ideas, but we haven't been able to touch upon some of the questions coming in around the role of IFIs, innovative financing, and actually South-South cooperation as well within crisis countries and protracted crisis situations too. So unfortunately, what we'll try to do is to wrap those questions up and see if Jeremy and Marta are willing to provide some responses, and we'll get those out to you all on the mail out. There's a few data questions which Angus will respond to on the mail out as well, so that those questions are dealt with. But if you do have questions, particularly on the GHA, we can definitely take them, and I'm happy to be able to respond to them. I was going to spend a few minutes trying to summarize the comprehensive nature of our conversation over the last hour and a half. It's been fascinating and such an important discussion, and I feel we've skimmed the surface of the priority issues, but that in itself is very, very useful. And I think just by starting off and demonstrating that in a crisis situation, the need is growing, but also the scale of financing is growing, it's diversifying, and what we need to be demonstrating is the results from that and the impact of which financing mechanism are having the greatest impact where. Currently, the progress picture is very mixed, and so we need to be looking further into the details of actually how do we get some more information on impact and what's working where. And then we went to Jeremy's presentation, which was fantastic in actually highlighting the nature of the challenges we're facing, which are, as Jeremy points out, much more integrated. When we look at the number of least developed countries they're reducing, they're now largely the least developed countries are also fragile countries, often having come out of a conflict situation or actually having some form of humanitarian crisis at a national or subnational level within those countries. So by nature of the change in what we're seeing on the challenges that we're facing at a global scale, the development, humanitarian, peace actors are being driven together by what we're seeing at a global level, and we need to be able to work much more comprehensively together. But unfortunately, the structures and systems within which we're working with are very siloed, they're very fragmented, and they're not necessarily allowing us to supersede and move forward from them. So it was great that we were able to identify and focus in on the country-based pooled funds as one potential mechanism that could help, but I'm sure there are many more that we could be looking at. And I think from Marta's presentation in particular, what really struck me was the fact that we have a different language and different definitions. And I always say this as well when working across the sphere, that we're often talking about very similar things, but we have very different interpretations and the language we're using is different. And having that consistency in definitions is very important, and also ensuring what are the priorities, because there's a lot of things that need to be done, but where do we prioritize first is really important. Your last point, Marta, where you mentioned the inclusion of IFIs, it's complicating that space. It's also in some ways trying to bring a lot more faster pace approach and response into things, but actually it's not necessarily always, the IFAs aren't necessarily set up to provide humanitarian response. But what are they set up to provide, and how could they be supporting the response at country level as well is important. So lots of discussions, lots of comments and questions that have come in. But finally, I'd just like to thank all of the participants who've played a role in providing presentations and the keeping the conversation going, but also those of you who have been online and providing comments and thoughts and ideas on the chat box as well. Those are fantastic, and it just seems to me that this is again an important conversation that we all need to be having, and hopefully we've made some form of contribution today towards taking that forward. Thank you so much to everyone. Have a good day, morning, evening, night, wherever you may be. And we look forward to continuing to working with you all in some way. Thank you.